Every mastering engineer has at least one or two tools that they will use almost every day, as in plugins or analog hardware. But if we're talking about plugins, this EQ right here is one that I use almost every day. And it's if I have to touch anything with EQ, this plugin is probably the one I reach for first. It's not necessarily a new plugin, and it is fairly unique, such as if you're familiar with linear phase EQs, normally an EQ can either be linear phase or minimum phase, but would you believe that you would be able to variably adjust the phase linearity of each band within the same plugin? That's an interesting feature. Another thing the EQ can do is emulate the curves and the nature of some very sought-after pieces of hardware, such as a Sontec EQ or a GML 8200 or Pultex. It can emulate those curves and give you the proper response that you'll need to perform those functions within, again, one plugin. You can use this in a mid-side mode or a stereo mode and couple this plugin with the DMG Multiplicity plugin, and you've got one hell of an arsenal. This is the Equilibrium user interface. The very first time that you open this EQ installation, you'll be met with a setup wizard. This setup wizard helps you determine what type of EQ you want and how you want it to look. You've got graph, text boxes, graph and text boxes and knobs, graph, text boxes and knobs, and you can see over here an emulation of what it would look like. Click Next, and you can select, do you want many instances, but you want to lower the amount of CPU and the processing it requires to run those instances, or would you like fewer or even single instances with the highest possible quality at the cost of greater CPU consumption? Since I'm a mastering engineer, I used this one. Then you can select stereo, stereo with mid-side, stereo with independent left and right, or surround. Now this can operate as a surround EQ, but as we know, surround is kind of on its way out and it's not necessarily used today. This does not apply to Atmos or spatial audio. For mastering, I like to use stereo with mid-side. Then how large do I want the UI or user interface to be? For me, I love huge. Then, am I interested in accessing models of vintage EQs? Now this does not model exact vintage EQs. What it does is it tries to emulate the curves and the electrical characteristics without the noise and the harmonic distortion. For me, I like to use the extensive control for selecting models. And then finally, would you like metering on your UI? No, I just like EQ, or like some meters, just as long as I can see the audio passing, right? But for me, I like to have extensive metering and per channel controls. If I click Finish here, that will apply these settings to my user interface. But since I've already got my user interface set up like I like, I'm going to hit Exit. Now this is my user interface again. Here, I've got my bands. I've also got the bands down here, and you can configure all of this in the UI setup. I can move these bands around by clicking and dragging. I can select multiple bands and drag them both around, or select all of them and do the same thing. I can hover over each one of these and see a box with parameters in it, starting with the ability to activate or deactivate. I can also double click. I can also hold down Command or Control and click. Then I've got the ability to make this a stereo band, a left or a right band, or if I go into Setup and change this to a mid-side EQ, mid and side. I've got the type of band this is. Is it a peak band, high pass filter, low shelf, high shelf, low pass filter, or even a notch? If you hover over one of these, you can see the models that we can emulate. And because I selected the number of models to have the greatest amount of control, this gives me all of them. You've got an X here, which just deletes the band. You can also do an Option Command to get rid of the band. Once you've chosen your curve here, you can then select by clicking on the logo here what type of model that you would like to have. That way you don't have to go through here and navigate that way. So it just gives you another quick workflow. You can double click here to enter the parameters, or you can even click and drag those parameters, as you can see. And as a side note, because I've chosen the DMG model, I've got this little percentage here. What does this do? This changes how the Q narrows as I boost or cut. So if I boost here, notice the Q pretty much stays the same. If I set that to 100% and I boost, watch what happens to the Q near the bottom of the band. It narrows. And same thing for if I cut, it narrows. Now each one of these bands does not have to be a stereo mid or side or left or right. They can be different, but they are limited to whether or not the EQ routing is set up to be mid-side or left and right. On the left-hand side, I've got this little hidden function here. This gives me a shift where I can shift the whole EQ curve left or right, double click to go back to the center, or the scale. Double click to go back to the center, and then I'll hide that. Now one quick thing is if you've got a mouse wheel, you can hover over an empty space here and you can zoom in this way. Down here, as I mentioned, we have a piano roll. If I double click a key, it adds the band. If I hover over one of these or I want to drag it, it drags it, but it keeps it on one of the keys. Now, if I wanted to tailor that slightly, I can hover over this and I can adjust it based on the sense. You can also double click here and enter in the actual frequency. Unfortunately, it doesn't let you enter in the actual sense that you would like to adjust this by, but that's fine. Down here at the bottom, we have our knobs. Now we've got buttons here that show whether or not the EQ band is on or off, and it can also show you whether or not it's a shelf or a peak. For instance, if I want to change this to a low shelf, you can see here it changes that. Now notice the bands at the top are in a different order than the ones here at the bottom. If I want to correct that, I can right click in this area here and it corrects it. If I double click in this empty space here, I can add a new band. I can just keep adding them. And if I use Option Command or Control Option, I believe for Windows, I can get rid of these. Now if I add a new band here, it's again out of order. Again, I can just right click here in this bar and it'll rearrange them. Again, you can select the model of EQ that you're using. You can select, you can adjust the parameters here as you could before. You can also drag the parameters here over the text, or you can enter the text. Over here on the right, we've got left and right. This is the meter. If I play some audio here, which you won't hear the audio, but you'll see it playing. Here I've got my left and right. I can adjust these individually. I can mute, solo, set one out of phase from the other, or I can click this and whatever I do to one, it will happen to both. Then I've got my main gain output and my main meters here. I've also got a post, listen to post, and auto gain. Now these are not you listening to this audio. This is the meter that's listening to the audio. So if I want to look at pre-EQ, this is the meter that's showing me what's happening pre-EQ. And then what's happening post EQ. If I click Auto Gain allows me to compensate for the gain increase or the gain decrease based on the EQ setting. So if I've done a lot of boosting here, as you can see, I can auto gain that, and notice it brings down the level here. So it is actually auto gaining the output of the EQ. But if I want to apply that, I can right click that and apply this to the channel faders. You can see those have moved there. Also notice the auto gain disabled after that because I've already made the adjustment. Now let's go over this bar up here at the top, the menu bar. Preset. Every plugin has presets, so you've got a list of presets here. One quick note, if you have a preset that's built in, but you've got a number of presets under a folder, you can use these left and right buttons to toggle through those presets. You can even open presets here so that you can open a preset that's in a folder. You can save presets by clicking this little disk icon. One quick note that if you upgrade this EQ anytime in the future, in other words, you're uninstalling and reinstalling or reinstalling on top of it, be sure and back up that directory because you could potentially have your settings overwritten with the new installation. Next, we've got these buttons here. These can be enabled or disabled at will. Let me give you an example of this. If I load EQ2 and I want to use this curve, but I want to use it in EQ1's position. I don't want to lose my graph and I don't want to lose the shading under each one of these bands. What I can do is remove the GUI button here and then load EQ2. Now I've got the curve of EQ2, but I still have my grid lines and shading underneath. Another thing is DSP. If there's some DSP settings that you have that work with a specific EQ curve or are saved with a specific preset, you can choose not to load those. So in other words, if you've got a CPU intensive DSP that's saved with one preset, you can choose not to load the DSP processing for an EQ preset, but you can load the curve. So you can uncheck that if you want. Then if you want to just load the parameters, the DSP and GUI parameters for another EQ curve, you can do that as well. My EQ curve is still the same here, but I've loaded everything else to be what it was in the other preset. Now we have preset and bank. What is a bank? We'll get into that in a minute as well. So let's go to the next function. This is a full screen. You can see here it goes to full screen. If you click it again, it'll return to the way it was. And if you are in full screen mode, you can hit escape and that'll take you back here. You've got an undo and a redo. These may or may not be infinite, but these are useful for going way back in time. Now, a lot of plugins have an A and B setting. So that way you can choose between two settings, and you can also potentially automate going between those two settings depending on the plugin. This has an A through H, and each one of these can be a completely different curve. You can even copy. You can copy, like for instance, this A band over here to the D band. Then when I load my D band, it's the same thing. Let's say if I want to copy the A curve over to the D curve and then make some changes, I can do that. And then I can go over here and save this as a bank. Now, when I mentioned bank before, this is what a bank is. It's a collection of these settings. When you save a bank and you load a bank, it will load those settings instead of just a single preset. Pretty sweet. Next, we can show the EQ curve that I want to display. Here it's set to both. There's this one white curve that exists here. That's a stereo curve. If I set this to left only, it's going to show me my left only curve. If I set it to right, oh, it turns blue. That is the right curve. Now, if I set this band to right and then cut it significantly, then go back in here to show left, I don't see that one. If I show both, I can see both curves. And then of course I could see the right curve alone, which is the blue. Next on the menu bar is the setup, which we'll get into shortly because it's quite exhaustive. So let's move on to the analyzer. I'm going to play some audio here. You won't hear the audio because there's no reason to play the actual audio. But when I click the analyzer button, you can see the analyzer here. The analyzer is normally by default enabled, but I had it disabled here for my purposes. Here you can see three different colors. The light blue is the stereo combination of the two channels. The white is the left channel, and the blue in the background, the dark blue, that's the right channel. You can set the priority of those channels by looking at a primary signal and a secondary signal. If I set the primary signal to right and then set the secondary signal to left, I can rearrange those two. So this means that if there is a left signal that is behind the right signal is the one that's going to show up in front of that. And of course the stereo is in the very front. Now if I have a second instance of this, I can also set my primary signal to come from the other EQ. Here. Now the primary secondary only works in this particular analyzer, but there are some other analyzers that you can look at as well. You can still select a primary signal for each one of those, however. Next, we have a soft power button. This allows you to turn the EQ on and off with no glitches or pops or anything that would cause issues between enabling and disabling the EQ, much like enabling and disabling the actual plugin itself. So this is considered a soft bypass. Finally, you've got a clip indicator here. If it's lit, that means you've clipped, you've gone an over. Now you're not going to clip the EQ itself, but you're going to show that you've got an over that typically would be considered clipping. And you can set this between 0.0 decibels and minus 0.1. Now from there, let's go into the setup. We have DSP, render DSP, which we'll get into those in a minute because again, those are quite exhaustive. Let's go through the GUI. The user interface is what you're looking at, and it's mostly what you've set up in the setup wizard down here. And in fact, if you need to go through the setup wizard again, this is where you would start it. Now, each one of these can be expanded, and as you can see, there's many different options for each one. You've got the layout, remember that from the wizard. Knobs, whether you want to show or hide the graph, the knobs, the band strips, using text only down here. You know, you've got so many different options, but we'll leave them alone for now because you can spend some time just going through these options yourself. You can also save each one of these sections as a default. You can also propagate them to other instances, and then you can save all UI settings as a default and even propagate all UI settings to all instances. And you notice each section has its own load and save. One setting right here that I will show you that is important is band numbers. If I do a show here, look very closely here, you can see these band numbers. Why is that important? This is based on when the band was added. So if I add another band down here on the low end, it's number 6. Well, why would that be a number 6 if that's down on the low end? Well, the whole idea is to consider automation. If you add and remove bands in automation, you want your automation envelopes not to be orphaned or to be posted to another channel. So that's a great way to do that. Plus, down here at the bottom, since I've got my bands that are completely out of sequence, if I right click here to organize those, the band numbers up here still appear to be the same. So that's just a different way of tracking your bands, especially when it comes to automation. But there are a number of features that you can use here that are quite exhaustive. Like I said, it's best to just go through and try them out and then be able to recall from the setup wizard or from a load and save to remember your settings that you had before. Note also from frequency sorting in the bottom where I would sort my frequencies, I could set this to be click on create or always. Meters, I can change the type of meter. I can change where the meters are located. I can change different things about the meter scaling. So there's a lot to consider there. The analyzer, I can even try this where I can hide the EQ if I'm clicking the analyzer. So when I click analyzer, I can see it completely by itself. If I want to hide my keyboard or show it, this is where you would do that, is right here. And then plenty of other miscellaneous changes, including the Autogain weighting, which can be applied to the Autogain feature down here at the bottom. Routing, the stereo mode can be left or right or mid-side. Global prefs, these are things about like keystrokes, how certain things just operate globally, including your mouse wheel. And again, you can save these settings as default. Okay, now let's get into DSP. We have two different places where DSP can be configured. We have the primary DSP, which is real time, and then we have a render DSP, which is offline. So when you're rendering your audio for output, this is where that DSP can differ from the DSP that you're listening to in real time. This makes a huge difference in mixing. We have different parallel modes. We have an all series, peaks parallel, and a peaks and shelves parallel. What are these about? In all series or a series EQ, generally the way that it works is you've got the first band has an input signal coming into the plugin. Then the output of that goes into the second band, and then to the third band, and then to the fourth, and so on. So the first band's gain or reduction can impact the input to the second band. Also, any phase correlation or any phase shifting that might happen in the first band will also apply to the second, third, and fourth bands as you go on. If you select parallel, and this only applies to the peaks, not the shelves, you get the same signal that's fed into each one of the bands simultaneously. By doing that, that means that each band can affect that area of the frequency range individually without the impact of another band. And it won't subsequently impact another band that is subsequent to that one. The benefit here is that you can make more subtle changes without affecting the other bands, certainly not with phase. And finally, we have peaks and shelves parallel, where the shelves on each end of the spectrum will also be given that parallel signal input and output. So what's the drawback of using series? Well, one, like as I mentioned, you can have a previous band affect the subsequent bands going down the line, whether it comes to phase or boost or signal, whatever. There's a lot of things that can happen there. Parallel, again, it just makes it so that you can separate the bands so that they only process what their width is and they don't affect the other bands around them. Now, there's a drawback to that. If you think of mixing, and if you have spent a lot of time mixing, especially with parallel EQ, sometimes you know that you will have a parallel EQ that is set aside on a channel and it's mixed in with the unaffected signal. And when you start boosting and cutting, especially in the low end, you may start hearing phase issues. You may start hearing cancellation happening. Well, that's always the possibility here. If you've got two different bands that may be boosting and cutting kind of in a very close proximity to each other, the phase may end up canceling the other frequency out. So that's always a possibility, but generally, if you're not making any big moves with EQ and you're not playing kind of in the same bandwidth, you're probably fine. Mastering engineers love to use this method. Now there's these different processing modes. We have IIR, infinite impulse response, and finite impulse response, or FIR. These are some things that apply only to digital EQs. They don't really apply to analog EQs so much because analog EQs use analog filtering. They use analog components. They don't really understand what impulses are. But we have to have a way in the digital realm to emulate the analog world. This is what these impulses require. Now I won't go into all of the finite engineering details of what these filters do, but I have some links up here that you can go and check out and just get ad nauseum all of the detail in impulse responses that you want to get. But I will say this, if you don't understand that, go and look at that material now and then come back to this. Some of the things that I'll cover going forward will make a little bit more sense. Now, the infinite impulse response, or IIR, is the least CPU intensive processing mode. This is the mode you'll normally use if you're using many instances of this plugin and you don't really require the absolute best of the best processing, but it's still really good. Since IIR has some limitations, you still have the ability to compensate for phase shift to bring this more, like for instance, IIR does not have the ability necessarily to be a linear phase or a phase linear EQ. Because of that, you're going to get phase shift in an IIR processing mode. However, you can still compensate by a number of samples the phase shift, so that way that phase can be compensated for by a number of samples. And if you do this properly, you can make your signal, your impulse response, a lot more accurate, a lot closer to what linear phase would sound like. And the way the DMG manual states to start this is if you hear some phase shifting going on, try starting with the lowest setting here. Set it to 16. Do you hear any improvement? If you do, great. Go on to the next one. If you hear still some improvement, keep going. And go again. If you don't hear any improvement, okay, then stop there. That's probably fine. That's where you need to stay. And then you can also compensate a little bit. This is sort of a guess, a little mathematical guess that the EQ is making to help with the phase shift that's going on in the digital realm. Some of these settings are brought over from the equality plugin. And again, you can propagate these settings to all of your instances. Now let's get serious and let's go to the FIR mode. I want to start with this one, linear phase. These graphs are going to show you two different things. One, your phase shift, which is going to happen here, and then your impulse response, which happens here. We don't really have anything going on here because this is a perfect phase linear response, but we have a little bit of what's called pre-ringing. So we've got a little bit of this here where the impulse is going to be applied to the EQ band, and just because of the way that it works, it is going to apply a little bit of pre-ringing, or you're going to get a little bit of pre-ringing in your impulse response. Again, if you go through those other videos, which I'll put the links up here again, they will describe a little bit more what pre-ringing is about. The one thing I can tell you pretty quickly is if you think of an impulse as like a tick, just a quick little snap of something, almost like a firecracker going off. What it is a 24 or 16-bit word, and this is a sample, a single sample, but that single sample represents all frequencies from the bottom end of the spectrum all the way up to the highest frequency, up to the Nyquist. And that is passed through this calculation here, and then it's also passed through the EQ settings that you have. So if you have an EQ setting in a certain band, then it will apply that against this calculation and give you an impulse response. That impulse response is applied to the signal, and then you get your changes in your phase correlation, whatever happens. Now, if I go to full minimum, you can see here the impulse response starts here at completely zero. That means there's no delay. So if I go back to linear, yes, there's a delay here. Go to full minimum, there's no delay. But look what happens here. I've got some phase shift. Interesting. If I go back here to my EQ, let me use this curve. But you can see here, wow, look, this is interesting. This is what's called a phase wrapping. It's where you go completely 180 degrees out of phase, but then you come back around in a cyclical fashion because of the way phase works. It goes into a 360-degree circle. So it's wrapping back around from 180 degrees, or from a minus 180 degrees here, back to 180 degrees here, and then back to zero. Or as it comes up here, it gets closer to zero. So that's called a phase wrapping. That's seen a lot in room measurements when you're measuring rooms for acoustic analysis, but that could be considered to be bad. So we may not necessarily want that, but it may be low enough and we don't really hear the difference. So that's not something we're that worried about. But if you are, there is a way to get rid of that. There's two other settings here called zero latency analog and analog. I won't go into those, but they're just another few choices that you can use for your processing mode and your phase response. You can just try those out and see how they work for you. But let me go into the really interesting one, which is called free. Free allows me to do something that is quite unique to this plugin. It allows me to not only have linear phase or phase linear and minimum phase, but it allows me to adjust each band differently. Even more, it allows me to adjust each band variably. So I don't have to actually be completely linear phase or completely minimum phase. I can adjust those. Look here. In this particular setting, I've got these little dots here which represent the frequency bands that I have. Down here at the very bottom, this is considered minimum phase. Up here at the line at 0 degrees, that would be considered linear phase. If I grab this ball, I click and drag, and I grab that and move it up. Look what happens to that phase wrapping. It kind of goes away. And then I can bring this up to linear phase. Oh, but what happens here? I get a lot more pre-ringing in my impulse response. Well, that may not be something I want. Okay, if I go minimum phase, I've got a phase wrapping. I don't want that. But if I go to linear phase, I get pre-ringing. Well, I can find a nice little balance in between. I can find here that probably around 15 Hertz, I don't really care about that phase wrapping, but I want to lower my amount of pre-ringing that I'm bringing in. So maybe I can find a good balance here. That's one way to do that. And I can do the same thing here in the middle. That one's probably not bad to bring it up to linear phase. It's just going to make it a great EQ curve with very little phase impact. And then up here in the top end, we've got a similar situation. Now let me show you this. When I bring the top end down, I get a little bit of analog pre-ringing. I may not necessarily want that, but I may not be able to hear it. Either way, if I bring this up to linear phase, look what happens to the impulse response. It sharpens up. And right there, I get a perfect impulse response. Yes, it's delayed, but that's just, delay compensation can kind of help with that. Either way, I don't see any pre-ringing regardless. Now, that helps me also eliminate some of the pre-ringing by bringing this up. Not by much, but it does do a little bit. So this is really great for playing around with the phase linearity of each band in the EQ, and it's worth spending some time getting familiar with. You've also got some zoom functions here. I can set this to be left or right, or if it's a mid-side EQ, I can set that to mid-side. I can set my range, and then of course that's got a zoom. Now let's go down here to impulse length, which is essentially the width of the envelope that is used to calculate the impulse response against the band settings in the EQ. The higher you go here, the more CPU intensive this is, but it gives you a wider window. If you go down lower, oh, that looks terrible. You have a lighter CPU load, but your impulse response that you're using to calculate those settings, it kind of starts looking ugly. It's not quite as precise as you'd like it to be. But notice here, because now I have some wraparound from the pre-ringing or the post-ringing here, over here, well, that's not so good. Now we're getting a little bit of pre-ringing. We don't really want that, so we can pad the impulse a bit. Let's add this a little bit more, a little bit. And you can see I'm getting rid of that pre-ringing that's happening there. All right, let's go back to 65. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out about post-ringing. Post-ringing is something that just normally happens with every EQ, but because generally the post-ringing is mixed in with the actual audio signal, it's almost inaudible. You don't really hear it. We also have the window shape. This is this purple line here. We can change that to different shapes. And again, that affects the calculation of the impulse response against the band settings of the EQ. Some of these are not really usable, like for instance this one. That may be used for analytics or may be used as a tool to measure other things, not necessarily for audio. The Kaiser is probably the most widely used, and it's by default. To be honest with you, it's probably the only one you're ever going to need, but the others are there if you'd like to try them out. You can also change the width of this window by doing this. And finally, you can propagate these settings to all of your instances. Now let's go to Render DSP. Render DSP by default is disabled. If you enable it, what this allows you to do is apply a separate processing to your rendering or your exporting, your mixdown, than what you're using when you're playing back. Because when you normally play back on a DAW, every plugin and everything is all going through one CPU core, and it's just the way that that works. There's not really a great way to balance the cores unless you've got some really good DAW, or your DAW has an ability to share that load between CPUs. Because of that, normally you're only going to use one CPU during playback, and it's handling all of your plugins. So you want them to be light in real time, but when you process, you want all the power that you can get, because then you can balance that across multiple cores. Up here, let's assume that I want to set this to IIR mode. But in my render DSP, I want to use FIR mode, and I want to use the free that I've used before. Going back here, when I set this to free, and I made these settings changes, whatever I wanted to do here, I need that to be carried over to the render DSP. Now you notice those graphs are invisible here, but those graphs, everything you've done on those graphs would be brought over here to this render DSP, except for these 4 settings down here. So I can set this impulse length to a really large length, and I can even pad it to the max. And again, I can propagate this to all of my instances. So that's the render DSP. So I said this was a very flexible and functional EQ. This is probably considered to be an engineer's EQ, because if you understand all the ins and outs of how EQ plugins work, then you'll understand the functionality of this EQ plugin and what it can really do for you. This is one to definitely grab and hang on to, because there probably won't be another EQ like this in the future. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Go ahead and click the like button. Love to see you. Thanks.